Good morning, Year 10. I am here today to teach you about your new poem today from your Power and Conflict anthology, Ozymandias. So please find that within your anthology if you have it available to you. Otherwise, you may want to grab a copy from the internet and just make sure that you can see it and analyse it. You'll be making copious notes today and making sure that we understand this poem fully. Just as last lesson on the previous poem, Storm on the Island, this will, as a lesson, be almost like a two-parter. So if we were in the classroom, this would take about 2 hours. Okay, so feel free to do this in 2 parts over 2 days, completely up to you, or if you're in the zone, just go ahead and work through it. So if we were in the classroom, imagine that we are, this would be the first slide that you would have as you walk in as your starter activity. So as usual, no phones in the caddies today, but do make sure that they are away and you are free from distraction. So have a look at the image for me. I want you in your exercise books to write your title, Ozymandias, today's date, and then this image. I want you to bullet point for me what you think on earth, this poem might be about. I've chosen this image. It's quite widely used by teachers as a starting point for the ideas, the notions of power that might well be seen within this poem. So this one is quite power centric. So there are, like all the poems, there will be evidence of conflict too, but we're largely talking about power. So I've asked you, what idea or ideas might the image evoke? Okay, what does it bring to mind when you see this? You can see what's going on here. We have some sort of statue. The statue is quite intricately placed upon a pedestal. A pedestal is an elevated level of ground, like a podium. And there seems to be some sort of crane tied like a noose around this. I can only imagine the leader, this kind of figurehead, their neck. And they seem to be being pulled down. So what sorts of ideas regarding power could this image evoke? Now, if you're stuck, I've got a little hint in red there, and you see on the left-hand side, there is quite a famous idiom, a popular saying, to trigger some ideas, and I think it's worth writing down. At the top of your poem as well, pride comes before a fall. And we'll talk about it again in just a moment. So take 3 minutes for me, pause the video. What ideas of power does this image evoke? Off you go. Okay, welcome back. Now, I'm not going to spend ages on this as the poem itself explores these ideas, but just this popular idiom, pride comes before a fall. Now, you might remember the key term I used in the last video, and that was hubris. Okay, H-U-B-R-S. Hubris is a tragic term, a tragic trope that we talk about quite a lot at A-level. And it means this sort of excess, you've got too much of it, of pride, of sort of self-belief and self-worth. So this figure here, this statue that represents a figure, a figurehead, is being torn down. Now, it looks like it might have been placed there some time ago. The pedestal is weathered. The style is a little bit outdated, archaic. And so whoever is pulling this down, therefore, no longer deems it to represent any sort of real or contemporary, up-to-date notions of power. So, I mean, who gets a statue of themselves? Who does that? Is it someone that feels that they have, a real sort of valuable place on this earth, that they have made an indelible, a permanent mark, and so they feel that their time spent on this earth should be commemorated in bronze or in a statue for others to behold, to look upon, and to sort of, acknowledge their great power, their sort of potent energy. So you could say that their pride helped them to create, or encourage them, their sort of hubris, their excess of pride, encouraged them to create such a statue. And then, of course, it seems inevitable that as time moves on, as we move forward, and history is no longer so potent, no longer so relevant, that these sort of remnants of the past are pulled down and replaced, and that whoever this figure is is no longer this powerful, prideful figurehead. Okay, so his pride that he had, his hubris to create the statue in the first place, that came before the inevitable fall. Okay, because time changes all. Okay, it changes all. So, really like that idea. Hopefully you had something similar, that, you know, power is sort of ephemeral, it's impermanent, it doesn't last. And, you know, we've seen that with so many sort of tyrannical leaders throughout history. The most obvious, of course, is Hitler, sort of Stalin, anyone that sort of led a totalitarian regime and has great excessive power and pride. They inevitably were usurped, you know, brought down from their pedestal of power. And really, Year 10, that is what this poem is about. Okay, if we were going to boil it down to its component parts, look at the top there, my little secondary subtitle, Anthropocentrism and Power. You could look at this poem through the lens of nature as well, through a kind of eco-critical lens. That's people studying how nature is represented in literature and in art. And I think that's an interesting way of looking at it, because if you remember, anthropocentrism is the belief that we humans are the superior or central force on Earth, and that everything else within a hierarchy is thus inferior, including nature, ironically. So in this poem, you know, we've got this idea that, you know, this statue that we first created would have been this man-made wonder to represent power. Over the years, nature has come along and it's weathered it and it's pulled it down. I mean, look at these famous landmarks on the right-hand side, these little snapshots. We've got Stonehenge there at the bottom. You know, they were once sort of these absolute tableaus of power. Put that on the left-hand side. They originally were meant to represent, to capture these tableaus, these images of great power, of civilizations that sort of held sway and were dominant. But how do they appear now? I mean, look at them. This is them now. This is how they appear to this day. They are weather-beaten, weathered, half of them sort of sunk into the earth in this sort of physical state of decay. Okay, that's a great word for today. Physical state of decay. So I want you to pause again. I'm talking quite a lot at the start of the video because it's dealing with some complex ideas of power, humanity's, you know, visions of power, and how history, time and nature actually usurp man-made power. Okay, please make sure you have that written down. So how might then, why have I given you these images? How might these images relate to the poem? Okay, if you know who Ozymandias is, you might already have a huge sort of stepping stone into this poem. Okay, we are talking sort of a pharaoh, the ancient Egyptian times, and think about, you know, where that power is today. Okay, so how might these images relate to some of the ideas in the poem? Have a little pause, just jot a couple of notes down, and then I'll meet you back in just a moment. Okay, I think it's worth, number one, reading the poem. That's always good, right? It's a poem, so it's part of sort of oral tradition. It must be read aloud, it must be heard, it must be felt. And then I'll give you some context, okay? So you can write down some notes for context just after I've read the poem. It is a short poem, okay? It's probably our shortest poem. In fact, it is in the collection. And it is written in a sonnet form. And if you remember, sonnets are traditionally penned on the themes or topic of love. Now, what sort of love might we be talking about here? Certainly not the romantic kind, okay? We'll come back to that in just a moment, but let's read it. Here we go. I met a traveller from an antique land who said, "Two vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them, on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read which yet survive, stamped on these lifeless things, the hand that mocked them and the heart that fed. And on the pedestal these words appear: My name is Ozymandias, King of kings, look on my work, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing besides remains. Bound the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare the lone and level stands stretch far away. Okay, so it's a curious little poem. Don't be fooled by its size, its sonnet form. There is an awful lot of depth we can get from this poem. Now, before I go into the intricacies of line per line and we look at some lexical items and their connotations, let's have a little go at some of the connotations. So on the left hand side there you can see just an image there from Google of one of these sort of relics of the pharaohs, the ancient Egyptian times, and this poem does include a kind of a mini narrative of an ancient Egyptian pharaoh, Ramesses II. So this is the figure that we are looking at in this poem. Okay, so Ozymandias is synonymous with Ramesses II. That's who it represents. Okay, so those two titles are for the same person. Okay, the same ruler. The Greeks just called him Ozymandias. So again, those two terms are interchangeable. Don't be confused by that. Ramesses II, Ozymandias, the same person. Okay, now according to the story, the temple, we can see a temple-like structure at the top there, just to give you a visual aid, that sort of was meant to honour him in his life, was said to actually have the inscription placed upon it which read, and you can see it there in the bottom in red, I am Ozymandias, King of Kings. If anyone wishes to know how great I am, and the place where kings like me lie, let him surpass any of my works. So, I mean, you have to laugh. It is absolutely saturated with hubris, those declaratives that were, penned there and stamped upon the temples where he went to live in death, I suppose you could say. And look at the way that he phrases himself. And this was obviously inspired Shelley to place parts of this in his actual poem. We've got the phrase King of Kings, which is in the latter half of the poem on the right hand side. And King of Kings is a superlative, guys. If you're the King of Kings, you are the absolute example of power. The absolute example of sort of king-like royalty and power. So he is King of Kings, and he says, if anyone wants to know or wants to sort of observe my power, just visit any of my great temples that I commissioned. And you can imagine how long they took to make, years and years and years and years of slave labour to create those structures. I'm sure you've heard about that. With the Egyptian, historical ancient architecture, they were commissioned by very wealthy people, and it was slaves, those that were abused and exploited for their manual labour, that had to create them. So it's just hugely ironic that he would stamp upon it, this is where great kings lie, and if you want any glimpse of my power, just gaze upon any of these structures. So hugely prideful, massively hubristic, as in too much pride, and because his creations were mocked up by slaves, by those that were abused, he was a tyrant. Okay, he was a tyrannical ruler, and so Shelley here, as a romantic with a capital R. A romantic with a capital R is just a poet or an artist that was writing in the latter half of the 19th century into the early part of the 20th century, and they were very interested in issues like how nature is represented in the, how the green world is represented, if it's abused, if it's absent altogether, interested in institutions of power, so things like the church, the monarchy, tyrants or tyrannical figures. And the Romantics were just very interested in the individual, in individual people, everyday people, and championing the creative imagination. We talk so much about this at A-level as we study Blake and Keats, who are also romantics, but Shelley was a romantic poet as well. They were in their own little boys' club of romantics, they were, and Shelley was quite a key writer. So, there it is. Let's move on. Some more context for you. I was just saying this, but it's worth pausing, making sure you get this down. Of course, he used slave labour to build these structures, and I mean, they suffered extreme hardship. I can't even empathise because I myself have never experienced anything to that extent in my privilege. Okay, empathy is when you can place yourself in someone else's shoes due to your own past experiences. I cannot empathise. Of course, I can sympathise, but language seems to fall short of the suffering they must have endured under his control. Okay, he was a tyrannical ruler, a figurehead that abused his power, okay, to great lengths. Now, if you were to visit any of these memorials or these statues today, you would find most of them crumbled into the sands of the desert. Okay, no longer erect, no longer to be seen as these tableaus of power, but crumbled, okay, lost. And there has to be some sort of justice in that, right? Okay, this tyrannical figure that felt his works would leave this indelible, this permanent, like a tattoo sort of moment of his power, and yet they are lost, most of them, or they are extremely weather beaten, as you can see from the example on the left hand side. They're no longer these what's the phrase I want here, these perfect moments, sort of Polaroids of power. They are destroyed to a large extent. Now, I found this quite interesting. During his time, his reign, he built more temples and monuments. He took more wives. He had 8 wives and had more children. Over 100 children. I mean, there's pride in that as well. I mean, just that fact, over 100 children, it's like the idea that he thought, he wanted to pass down his genetics, pass down, his identity and his sense of self to many generations than any other pharaoh in time. Okay, more than any other. Okay, more temples, more wives, more children than any other in history. Okay, he built those memorials for himself, which he imagined would last forever. Completely foolish, misguided, of course, and that is a hubristic example of human folly. Okay, folly means foolishness. So where are we? We've been talking about power and how, its abuse, but also the foolishness and hubristic qualities that come along with excess of power. Okay, pride comes before a fall, and I think that's summed up really nicely in the context as well. Okay. I want you to have a little go. Now that we've read the poem, we've had a little discussion of its context and some of its key ideas. I want you now to have a go at writing down this question for me on the right hand side. How is Ozymandias presented to the reader in the poem? You are not going to write too much here, but I want you to start with a quick plan. So you see this box in red. I've asked you to write down 5 adjectives, so describing words, that you would use to describe this character, this individual within the poem. And please go ahead and choose 5 small, make them small, the smaller the better. You can even have a 1-word micro quotation here. 5 quotations to match up with those 5 adjectives. So you'll do that first on the right hand side. And then once you've done that, you're going to summarise what we've learnt so far, okay, by copying out what's in the pink box on the left hand side and filling in your top 2 adjectives to describe him. So in those little spaces, there needs to be nestled 2 adjectives of your choice. Okay, so you're going to probably need about 10 minutes for this, so go ahead and pause the video to do so. Okay, welcome back. So hopefully you had a go at thinking of some adjectives to describe this character. I did the same, and my top 4 adjectives, my top 5 adjectives I've put on the left hand side in the yellow now. So definitely prideful and hubristic, egotistical and tyrannical, and the last one that I haven't written on there would be something like foolish or full of folly as a phrase. Okay, so those would probably be my 5, or I guess misguided you could use if you want a simpler 5th one. So what did I say on the top left? I said this narrator in the poem. So it starts with, let me just go back just to remind you. Look here where it says at the start of the poem, I met a traveller from an antique land who said. So you don't actually ever hear from Ozymandias firsthand. So you have this unknown narrator who says, well, when I was journeying, I met this traveller from this antique land. And antique suggests something old, forgotten, no longer new, powerful. And then they said, and then the rest of the poem is dialogue that's recalled, in terms of this traveller, this conversation this traveller had. Okay, so Ozymandias' voice is kind of absent there. Anyway, that's what I mean by the narrator. The narrator in this poem tells us the story that he heard from a traveller he met in an ancient land. The traveller recalls how he saw a huge statue in the desert of Ozymandias, and then you would put your words in there, a tyrannical and hubristic leader. All of this seems now empty, and the statue lies decaying and crumbling. Okay, that year 10 is pretty much all that's all that happens in the poem. There isn't this huge event. There isn't a succession of characters or key moments. It is quite literally the narrator met a traveller. The traveller told him about his sighting of Ozymandias' statue. Now, please remember, he didn't see Ozymandias. He saw his statue. Okay, and we're assuming this is hundreds, thousands of years after his reign. Okay, and he found it in the desert, abandoned. Okay, with nothing else around it, completely alone and shattered. Okay, decayed, weather-beaten. And that is really all that happens. But it's up to us to figure out, well, what comment is Shelley trying to make about human power in this poem? If this token of power, this statue, has now been swept away, is in this barren desert location where really no one, apart from this odd traveller who just happened to find it at random, sees it anymore. And the great irony, the great humour the reader might have when they read that line from Ozymandias, and just going back again to the poem, where the inscription said, look on my works and despair. Okay, this really kind of tyrannical imperative. Look at my works, look at all that I have, and feel small, feel powerless. Okay, feel tiny in comparison. And yet this traveller goes, well, it was there. Sorry, I'm going back again and whizzing around a lot today. It was there. Okay, but if you look at it, it says towards the bottom that nothing beside remains. So there's nothing around it anymore. And he calls it a colossal wreck. Colossal means obviously huge, a huge wreck. Okay, it's also, if you look at the top as well, it's trunkless, two vast and trunkless legs of stone. So parts of the statue aren't even there anymore. Okay, limbs have been taken off, or parts have been, lost to nature and time's power. So it really is ironic when he reads the inscription that remains on it. Okay, you are going to have a little note in your exercise book of what this title means. Okay, so you are going to need to complete for me in your activity booklet that I have sent you along with this link on EduLink, and you will need to complete activities 1 and 2. But really briefly, Ozymandias, when you break this noun down, there are 2 component parts to it. So Ozy comes from the Greek ozium, which means either to breathe or air. Okay, and then mandias comes from the Greek mandate, which means to rule. Now, if you put the 2 together, there are actually some really strong connotations. His name almost seems to evoke ideas of he finds ruling so natural. It's like breathing in oxygen. Okay, it's inherent in his very sort of DNA, his very body. Okay, power exists there. He believes very naturally. Okay, to breathe air is to rule. Okay, but there is a kind of slight irony in this title, because Ozy, the idea of breath or air, breath and air, it's quite a transient thing. You take in a breath and then you exhale and it's gone. Okay, out of your system, you're taking a new one. There isn't kind of a a permanence to air or breathing. And if we're being really morbid, we humans, we do not live forever. Okay, we aren't robots. We're not, we're not here forever. We can't, whilst many people, rulers throughout history, I'm sure, try to find ways of living and ruling forever. Ozymandias, his rule, his power, is ultimately ephemeral. It does not last. It was fleeting, just like a breath in and out, and it's gone. So there is some quite interesting connotations there already, but I want you to have a go now. Pause the video. You're probably going to need about 12-15 minutes, slightly longer now, as you have a go at activities 1 and 2. So pause the video now, year 10, and I'll check back with you in a moment. Okay. Welcome back. Hopefully you've had a go at those tasks and you were able to have a go. I just want us to catch up and to pause for a moment because we have already looked at a lot. Now, if I were you and you're feeling a little bit flustered, a little bit overwhelmed, there's been a lot already this morning, this is your chance to pause the video and to see this as the start of the second half. Okay? If you like, you can come back to this later on, or you can go ahead and just carry on through. I do not mind, okay? If you've got something better to do, I understand, but if not, then let's stick with it. So, if you had a pause and you came back, or if you didn't, we are just going to take a moment to check in. A lot has been said. So, what I would like you to do is the activity on the left first, then the one on the top right, and then the one on the bottom. There's 3 activities here to get through. So the first one should be quite quick, guys. Read the poem through again twice, read it once more, second time. Okay, what do you think it's about? Sum it up in no more than 2 sentences. Do that now. What is it about? 2 sentences only. Sum it up in your book now. Okay, now that you've done that in no more than 50 words now, what is it about? But this time, okay, you must actually reference why you think Shelley wrote this poem. What comment was he trying to make? Because he was not alive, year 10, during the sort of Egyptian era. Okay, he was not alive during that time. He was alive during the 1800s, sort of that period. And so there's hundreds and hundreds of years between those civilizations. So why did he choose Ozymandias, this ancient Egyptian pharaoh, Ramesses II? Why was that his topic? What do we think he was trying to do? Is there a chance he was trying to criticize the rulers, the government of his own time? And he used this idea of Ozymandias, this statue, this ancient ruin, as a kind of veiled way of criticizing his contemporary government. Could that be part of it? Okay, have a little think, give yourself a couple of minutes, no more than 50 words. What is Shelley trying to do? Once you've done that, you're going to have a go at activity 3 in the booklet as well. So you need to pause here, mop up these tasks, and meet me back in a moment. Here we go. Okay, thank you very much for that, year 10. You're doing really well. There's a lot to get through here. You were probably thinking this poem was going to go easy on you, being the shortest poem of the pack, but I'm afraid it does not. It is, however, an examiner favourite. It has come up twice already in the exam, and to be honest, it could come up again, or it could be that it's the poem that you choose to compare with the one that's named. Remember, in the exam you will be given the poem that you have to talk about, and then it's up to you to choose the poem that you think best fits with it. Okay, so we don't discriminate in our poetry pack. We know all the poems well, we understand what they all mean, and we have a good understanding of mitzvah for each poem as well. And if you remember, it's meaning, imagery, technique, structure, language, or technique, tone in the centre. Okay, and that's what we're going to do now. So you will need your poem in front of you. You will need your beautiful highlighting pens if you have them. Don't worry if not. I just know that some of you like them. And we're going to make your anthology nice and colourful now with our annotations. So let's take the first line. I met a traveller from an antique land who said. So look at the top left there. The poem begins with the narrator who relays what was said to him by a traveller. Now notice the narrator doesn't have a name, the traveller doesn't have a name. The only person that's named in this poem is Ozymandias. Now, I don't think that's to say that the narrator and the traveller are unimportant. I don't think that's the point at all. I think it's just another method used by Shelley, again, to show this kind of foolish pride that Ozymandias had in himself and his identity. The only name in the poem is his. Okay, so we could look at that as well. Now, you could say that this poem exhibits what we call a story within a story. So we have the story of the narrator meeting the traveller, but then the story within that story is the story of Ozymandias. So it does have that kind of double-layered effect, the story within a story. I love the idea that could have been used by Shelley to show just how forgotten Ozymandias is. He is the story within the story. He's no longer the story. He's no longer the primary sort of character within a narrative. He's kind of hidden under a sort of a layered narrative. So I really like that as well. So there is look at this first line, there's a real distant or exotic feel to this setting. I met a traveller from an antique land. So this is what I was saying on the last slide. Shelley was not writing at this time in history, okay, in this Egyptian pharaoh period. He was writing in his contemporary world, and the king on the throne at the time was King George III. Now, he wasn't an especially well-liked ruler or monarch, and so I feel, and many critics feel, that this sonnet is his very romantic, with a capital R, way of criticising his actual government at the time. Now, you only have to go on Facebook today, right, to see so much criticism of our current government, and the same can be said for many other governments or presidents around the world. But in Shelley's time, it was not the norm, okay, to be vocalising any sort of dissent or subversiveness for your rulers. You weren't supposed to be vocal in your disagreements with those in power. So this poem is quite a dangerous thing for Shelley to have written, which is why I think it works as a criticism of his contemporary ruler, who he felt was tyrannical as well. But he uses this antique land as his setting. It's this adjective you can see at the bottom there, suggests an ancient place, one that's aged, that retains value because lands still do with nature, but actually for me antique means it's out of touch, it's out of date, just like Ozymandias' power. Okay, such a genius use of adjective there in purple, guys. Okay, this traveller, he meets him in an antique land. Okay, so it's outdated, it's out of touch, just like Ozymandias' power, but also it's so ambiguous. Where's this land? What's he talking about? Where is it? Because he doesn't want to be himself the target of criticism for having a go at his government in this poem. Okay, so you could say this antique land is Shelley's distancing tactic. Okay, so that he can still criticise King George III, but he's not detected, because it's a very metaphorical story within a story. We've got this antique land. Okay, it's not easy to detect. Okay, so what is seen there? Well, look at this line here. What he sees is two vast and trunkless legs of stone, okay, that stand in the desert. Now look at these two. We're looking at the language here in the pink. Okay, we've got vast and we've got trunkless. So those two adjectives I've said are extremely uncomplimentary. Okay, when you describe this statue, it sounds unwelcoming. Okay, it's trunkless, so it's missing parts. And so the physical appearance here of Ozymandias actually makes it sound quite ugly, quite unappealing, uncared for, completely abandoned, no longer relevant. And of course, look at the left-hand side at the top there. I think those adjectives help to mirror the former ruler's really futile attempts at invincibility, right? He wanted to be invincible. He wanted to live forever through his art, through his works. But now it's just, they're vast, but they're trunkless. Okay, they're abandoned, they're weathered, they're decayed. So all of his attempts at power were futile. Futile means pointless, year 10. And I think that's what those adjectives get at straight away. Look at the use of setting in green there. Now, the desert is obviously a suitable and ironic place for this once glorious, powerful statue, because deserts are hostile environments, right? They are largely barren. You cannot live there, you cannot exist there, you cannot thrive there. Human life is not meant for desert climes, right? And so deserts are one of the key places where nature is allowed just to be. You know, what nature exists there is just allowed to be, okay? Because humans can't build upon it, they cannot necessarily live there anymore, okay? It's too hostile. There are so many other places that humans sort of live, right? And so the fact they just stand in the desert, that speaks to me of abandonment, okay? That nature now rules and reigns, and Ozymandias is irrelevant. Okay, his power is lost to the power of nature. Okay, so what about this trunk that sat there? Near them on the sand, half sunk and shattered, the visage lies. So next to the legs, which are off to the side, the top half of his torso lies. Now, look at the bit in yellow. It says here that they're half sunk and shattered. Okay, so his torso is half sunk and it's shattered, it's in pieces. So this bit has double meaning. So visage means face, and it's sunken into the sand from the years of neglect, where it's just been forgotten. But I think this could also be a really intelligent reference to the sculptor who was commissioned to make this. Now, this sculptor might well have done this on purpose, right? Created a work that actually wasn't that attractive to look upon. Okay, you've got some quite derogatory adjectives in this section. So it says here that it's kind of like a sunk and shattered visage. So his face there is not, it's not sort of pert, it's not handsome. And so it could be that the sculptor really did not like Ozymandias, and so in his works, in a subtle way, created something that kind of mocked or mirrored the kind of unappealing appearance of this tyrant. Okay, because we get it in the next line as well. Look at it. It says it, even on the visage of the face that the sculptor created, you can see Ozymandias' frown, and his wrinkled lip is like a sneer, yeah, of cold command. And it tells that its sculptor well those passions read, meaning the sculptor knew who he was sort of creating an image of and knew him well enough to be able to capture his cold command kind of on the face, on the visage. The visage, sorry. So the reader here is told that not only does this ruler have an ugly interior, okay, he's cruel and a tyrant, his exterior, his appearance seems to mirror that sort of inner cold reality as well. Okay, so you get here, look at this cold command. Though that sound there that comes through phonetically, obviously it's alliteration, cold command. But the consonant there, the C, they're quite harsh consonants, aren't they? Okay, for me they mirror the anger, the aggression of that tyrannical leader, Ozymandias. So cold command, it's harsh. It's a harsh alliterative consonant there, and it mirrors the harshness, the cold behaviour and demeanour of this ruler. Okay. Which yet survive. So the only thing that survived really is that sneer and that cold command that you can see on the face. That's the only real thing that survived. So what's his legacy? His legacy is just cruelty, and that's really the only thing, year 10, that people remember about him if they happen to think about him at all. Okay, so that cold sneer, that's stamped. But his statue is described as lifeless things. The two parts of it, lifeless things. So look at the top there. We're talking about the tone That's the thing we're looking at here, the tone for the T. It's ironic, it's satirical, it's meant to mock him, okay? It's just lifeless things. He's an arrogant leader. He wanted to be remembered fondly, to live on after his death, but ultimately his statue is lifeless, deserted, okay? It's just a crude kind of stamping of what he once looked like, okay? He is now mocked, okay? Mocked, not looked upon with envy or looked upon and sort of admired. He now is mocked, and you can see that literal word mocked in the next line. Now in this line, mocked means to mock, to make, to mock up something, okay? The hand that mocked them, that made the statue, but actually it has a double meaning, doesn't it? Because also to mock is exactly what Shelley is doing here, okay? To mock, to poke fun at, okay, the foolish endeavours of Ramesses II. Okay, so this moment though, the end of this line here with the end stop, the hand that fed, okay, that marks the volta in the poem. Now sonnets are written in a very specific way, okay? So you will have the first 8 lines, which is called the octave of the poem. The first 8 lines in a sonnet usually pose a problem or a key idea, okay? So you could say the first 8 lines pose this idea of Ozymandias's pride and the power that he thought he had, right? Okay, and then this point here with the end stop line marks the volta, marks the shift, and the last 6 lines of the poem, which is called seste, kind of explain or engage with the problem. So the last bit of the poem basically sums up the problem that, ultimately we might think we have power, but it doesn't last. The problem is time and nature are far more powerful than humans are. Okay, because it's a sonnet as well, think Shakespeare, you've got that heartbeat sound coming through. Okay, each line is written in iambic pentameter, so it's the 5 heartbeats, ba-bum, 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 ba-bum. So, which yet survive, stamped on these lifeless things, da-dun, da-dun, da-dun. So because of that, there's a very kind of regular stress pattern that runs through it, like the heartbeat, yeah? And you could say that structurally, that is to mirror just how regular his ideas of power were, how constant they were. I'm the leader, I'm in control, I'm superior, da-dum, da-dum, da-dum. But you could say that's obviously ironic, because what's really regular, what's truly constant, is the power of time and nature, and not him. You might want to pause after that one, because that was a little bit tricky. I've brought in some structure, the meter, and the kind of tone, which students usually find is a little bit trickier to get their heads around. I mean, as this is a video, you do get the bonus of being able to go back, listen to it again. Hopefully I'll make sense the second time. You never know. Okay, here we go. And on the pedestal those words appear. My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Okay, I showed you what a pedestal was at the start with that image. Go back if you need to. The noun pedestal is an interesting choice. It's a physical sign of elevation, isn't it? Okay, now that's the state of elevation, of superiority that he actually bestowed upon himself. Okay, that obviously hints at his arrogance. So the fact the statue is found on the pedestal is now ironic, of course, but it again shows the great pride that he had in his power. So it's written there, that's the inscription. I gave you the original one at the start of this lesson. So this tone here, when he says things like, despair when you look at me, look at how powerful I am, look at the imperative, look on my works. It's really ironic. His whole legacy has disappeared apart from this abandoned statue of him. Even the architectural brilliance isn't quite brilliant anymore, but that's the only thing that remains in any physical form, not him. He's gone, okay, and nothing else remains. So it's isolated in the desert. So nothing beside remains round the decay of that colossal wreck. Look at the enjambment there at the end of that first line, round the decay of that colossal wreck. Okay, there's no end stop. We flow with our words over when we read it out. And I think that shows the enjambment there, just how quickly his power was lost. We don't pause when we read. Look how quickly, you know, his power wasn't put on pause, it was just lost. Okay. Where are we? So of that colossal wreck, I spoke about colossal, that huge wreck. We're really using that superlative there to suggest that this is the worst for him. There's no power, it's completely ruined. And then look at those two adjectives, boundless and bare. You've got your plosive sounds, it's like it's like artillery fire. Okay, and I think it's really hamming home there so strong just how powerful nature is and time is in comparison to him. Okay, look at the last image of the poem. I always say the end of poems are the most important, and we end on this line: the lone and level sands stretch far away. So the last image is the moral of the story. It's like Shelley is telling us here that politics or politicians, or monarchs or tyrants in totalitarian regimes, whilst they have this great power and this corrupting influence, they do not last forever. Okay, now they are just relics of the past. They are antique. Their ideas, their ideologies, they're lost. Okay, and all that remains by the end are the sands that stretch far away. Okay, so nature remains. Stretch far away. You've got the sibilants at the end. There's literally drawing the sound out. Okay, and showing, mirroring nature's power. Okay, pride comes before a fall, and his fall is here, that colossal wreck, boundless and bare. Okay, so I don't want to do too much with this because I've already said an awful lot. There is a lot more for you to do personally now to add to your annotations using activity 4 in the booklet. Okay, so I've given you the key ideas, but there is a lot more we can still add. So pause this, give yourself 10-15 to complete activity 4. Okay, the last thing we're going to do with me, and then you will complete the rest of the activities by yourself, is this. You need to be learning your quotes as well, year 10, okay? You might want to go back over the poems we've studied and just read them again, really. Just check in with them. Okay, what can I remember from poems like Remains and Bayonet Charge? Okay, his bloody life in my bloody hands. I mean, I can just reel them off. I know the quotes. Make sure you do. Now, if you were going to choose, this is the last thing for your exercise book, just 5 must-have quotations from this poem, what would it be? Okay, if you could just have 5, make them short, make them meaningful, what would they be? Okay, I'll leave you on that note. It's up to you to finish the booklet now, the rest of the booklet, and make sure that's all done. There is a bonus video link in that pack as well if you want to watch some more analysis on this, but that is all for me for now. So I do hope that you are all well, year 10, and this is proving helpful. We'll work through as many poems as we can, but we are also going to be starting a Christmas carol as well. So just to break up a Christmas carol, just every so often I'll drop a poem in just to keep working through that as well, and we'll do as much as we can. Okay, you're doing really well. Please remember to comment below. Okay, or send me an email saying that you have finished this and you've done it, because I need to know. I need to know what you're up